Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. We are back doing these tastings, and I have decided that for the first 5 Whiskey Wednesdays, I'm going to be highlighting 5 whiskeys that I've had that I just found to be so much better than I anticipated that they would be just in looking at the label after buying them. I started with the Glenfiddich 12, the Cask of Amontillado. Really nice sherried whiskey, and so that was kind of my start into this. We're on to our second whiskey in this series for our Whiskey Wednesdays. It is Chattanooga Whiskey that we're going to be tasting today, and this is from their experimental distillery. If you heard my interview with Tim Piersant at Chattanooga, that is part of the Whiskey Flight series on the podcast. We did a deep dive, especially on the Patreon version. We really dove into some of the experiments that they're doing at their experimental distillery. That's the distillery you can actually go visit. They've got 2 in Chattanooga. One is their production facility, which is down near the Tennessee River. And then the other one is downtown along Market Street and right across from where the Chattanooga Choo Choo is. And that is the one that is the experimental distillery. They got a 100-gallon pot still there, and so they're doing all sorts of interesting different styles. And when we set the interview up, I was asked, what whiskeys would you like to taste? And I said, well, I've already tasted their flagship high malt bourbons, including their 111 and their 91. And so I wanted to kind of stretch beyond that. I've had their bottled in bond, but when I looked down the list, I saw they had an Isla cask, which I did a tasting of on the podcast. And the other one is the one that I'm going to be doing a tasting of today, which is their single pot still whiskey. And if single pot still sounds confusing to you, it was confusing to me when I first got to experience it. Redbreast was the first one I ever tasted. It is considered to be the Irish whiskey style. However, I do have my qualms with that concept because in doing some research into the pot still whiskey style, I had read actually that Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations book actually gave in 1776 a formula for making Scotch whiskey that included unmalted barley. And unmalted barley is the key to what pot still whiskey is. Basically, it's not a single malt, which would just be 100% malted barley. This is actually a combination of malted and unmalted barley, along with possibly a third ingredient. In this case, and in the case of a lot of Irish pot still whiskeys, they'll use oats, or they may use some other grain, or they may just actually use malted and unmalted barley and nothing else. The idea in Ireland is that you have to use at least 30% unmalted and 30% malted barley, and then you can figure out your proportions past that. You can't have more than 5% of that third ingredient. However, they are pushing to get that changed because historically, pot still whiskey was actually not that rigid in terms of its rules. That ruling actually came about because there was only one company in Ireland making whiskey at the time that pot still whiskey was defined in the modern age, and that was Irish Distillers, who makes Redbreast and Powers, different pot still whiskeys, and Green Spot. So when one company is the only one that's making pot still whiskey, they get to make the rules, and that's kind of what they did. So that may change over time. Now, I don't know what the exact proportions are in terms of malted and unmalted barley in this particular whiskey, batch number 47. However, put my grandpa glasses on here. Straight malt whiskey, it says, aged greater than 4 years. Now, there is straight malt whiskey in here. However, if it's got unmalted barley in it, then it's not all straight malt whiskey. It has floor malted barley, Calypso unmalted barley, pale malted barley, and Hullis malted oats. Distilled 2 times. Now, this is what's interesting about pot still whiskey. I believe, and this is just my But from my research, the reason that the Irish triple distilled was because of pot still whiskey, because pot still whiskey with that unmalted barley gets really oily. And so if you want to kill off some of those oils and maybe some of the flavors that you're getting in there, then you're probably going to distill a third time, whereas a single malt doesn't necessarily need that third distillation, as the Scots have proved through the years, and some of the Irish as well. So that's kind of the background on pot still whiskey. The first time I ever tried it was Chattanooga in Colorado. They are the ones that turned me onto it. And then when I traveled all through Ireland, I was in love with it. And what I found was that Redbreast was far from my favorite. Three Swallow is probably my favorite in terms of the big production pot stills. I do like the Powers, and I will do a tasting on Powers John's Lane at some point. That is a 12-year-old, which I think is very good. But I feel like pot still whiskey is somewhat like rye whiskey and peated whiskey, in that the longer it's in a barrel, the less the personality that you get from pot still whiskey. So does this Chattanooga whiskey live up to the expectations? Obviously, I'm doing this video today, and you've kind of been built up on the fact that I was really impressed with this whiskey. So let's go in and do a nosing and a tasting on this pot still whiskey. Now, initially, I get a little bit of lemon. It's a little spiky in terms of, this is 47.5 ABV, so 95 proof. So it's not overly strong, but my nose hairs are tickling a little bit with the alcohol on this. The char is what really stands out to me on the nose. Little bits of leather. I got a little minty, like Andes mints, dark chocolate. But it's very subtle. The char is really what stands out. It's one of the things that I'm going to have to figure out when I'm doing tastings of American whiskeys, how not to kind of, maybe dismiss or be put off by the char notes. It is something that I'm finding in a lot of American whiskeys. They're using, number 4 chars, and maybe in warmer climates, it's maybe too much for somebody who wants to have more of the underlying flavor to come through. I'm finding it more on the nose on this whiskey that the char is standing out. And so that's probably the only knock that I would put on the whiskey, is that it's probably a little bit more charry than I would appreciate in terms of a pot still whiskey. Let's do a tasting. Cheers. This is where they nailed it. I get the lemon notes, I get the grain notes, I get the pepper coming through. Those are the three things I look for. It finishes off again with a honey note, some grain note coming through. The lemon actually is kind of surrounding this whole thing on the finish. I get black tea notes coming in. Interesting that I get like a little medicinal note, and I don't know where that is coming from. It's not necessarily a big iodine, Band-Aid, Isla note, but it's there. It's really interesting, and I don't know exactly where that would be coming from in terms of the distillate, and it's connected to the lemon note that I'm getting off of this. But the thing that really made me happy when I tasted this whiskey was I did not expect that I was going to be tasting something this close to what I call an Irish style pot still whiskey with all that character. Doesn't have necessarily the body to it, and that could be due to how they're taking cuts on this particular whiskey. It'd be really interesting to see, if it could be down to the char too, maybe covering up some things. But the body of the whiskey, that's interesting that it was distilled 2 times and it's not overly heavy. It makes me think they probably didn't use as much in terms of unmalted barley as they did malted barley, maybe to stay safe on it and not go overboard. But the other character I'm expecting out of a pot still whiskey, definitely those notes are coming through on it. And so it's one of those whiskeys that I will keep around for my friends who love Irish whiskeys and want to see if there are American whiskeys. There's a lot of them out there. You'd be surprised, actually, in doing my Experiencing American Whiskey book and talking about all the distilleries across the country. There are so many I came across that were doing some kind of pot still Irish style whiskey. Some who could say they were doing it, some that didn't say they were doing it, because it is one of those geographical indicators for Ireland. And so you got to be very careful about using the name Irish when you are talking about an American whiskey. So they'll be harder to find. You may see them with some really interesting names to try to convey the fact that that's what the distillery was going for. But single pot still is probably what you're going to see most often. Unlike American single malt, it is not a defined category. So it is going to be something that may be a little potluck when you run into it. But I'm really happy with this. Unfortunately, they only made 5 barrels of this whiskey, so it's not something that's going to be easily found in the future. I'm going to have to milk my bottle as long as I can, but I am really happy to see what they're doing there at Chattanooga. And if you go down there, definitely check it out. See the experimental distillery and see what kind of whiskeys they've got sitting around. The Isla cask, as I understand it, is in larger supply in terms of your ability to get it. And you can look online too, because I think they are selling it online as well. I hope you enjoyed this review of my second whiskey out of 5 that we're doing here on the Whiskey Wednesdays, of whiskeys that I just really found interesting and worth telling you about. And have you had a pot still style whiskey that you are really a big fan of? Ireland, America, doesn't matter either way. Would love to hear about them. It is a style I really enjoy. And until next time, cheers and Slán Java.